morning, good afternoon, and a warm welcome to another Bonn Global session during the Daring Cities, featuring Bonn-based organizations and networks. My name is Susanne Nolden. I work at the Department of International Affairs and Global Sustainability of the City of Bonn, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to our co-hosts of today, the network Gender at International Bonn. That's an institutional network bringing together UN Bonn, UN Women Germany, GIZ, Deutsche Welle Media, North Rhine-Westphalia State, the City of Bonn, and our second partner will be the Gender Research Group at the Center for Development Research of the University of Bonn. Our topic today is shifting to female-driven climate action, with a special focus on financing this shift. We have a panel of experts here today with Women Engaged for Our Common Future, GIZ and ICLEI, and I'm particularly pleased to feature two of Bonn's sister cities today, La Paz in Bolivia and Cape Coast in Ghana, in our contributions. We will have a couple of polls bringing your opinions and experience to the table, and I all encourage you to participate in these polls. We will show them on the screen. Our moderator will read them out, and you will find both a QR code on the screen and a link in the chat. Please use the chat to bring up your questions today. We're curious what you are thinking, where you want to know more, where you want to add your opinion to the poll. And now I would like to hand over to Dennis Lucy Aviles Irajola of CEF, Center for Development Research. Dr. Dennis Aviles will not only share some of the academic findings of the Gender Research Group, but also be our expert moderator today. Thank you all for joining, hoping for a lively debate. And over to you, Denise. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne, for the kind introduction. I have to say I will not be sharing exactly the results of our group because, but rather from a broader academic research on the issue. I've been asked to set the scene for the panel discussion on a very complex and multidimensional topic within a limited time. So let me start now, and please, Julia, if you could move on to the next slide. So let me start by mentioning that this year's assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states with high confidence level that women are more vulnerable than men to climate change impacts on areas of malnutrition, livelihood loss, rising costs, water insecurity, mortality, and losses due to floods and droughts. And very importantly, the exacerbation of existing gender inequalities, which in times affects women's capacity to respond to extreme climate events during and after those events. For example, a brief from the UNFCCC affirms that the 90% female fatalities during Hurricane Gorky resulted from societal expectations of Bangladeshi women to remain at home, which both excluded them from accessing information and made them less likely to evacuate without a male relative. The next slide, please. We know by years and decades of academic research by now that people experience challenge from climate change in different ways, according not only to our gender and the social norms attached to it, but also due class, ethnicity, place, and others. And of course, we also face responsibilities for climate action from different capacities and positions. Women have been responding to climate challenges since long ago, as we can see in the examples here in these two pictures. In Haiti, responding to Hurricane Ike and Hannah in 2008, for example, by delivering food supplies, or the example of 1 million women in Australia, with the goal of get 1 million women to take small steps in their daily lives that save energy, reduce waste, cut pollution, and lead to change. So let's go to the next slide, please. We, of course, know by now that, climate, to fight climate change, and their impacts requires a very good amount of money, and the world has responded to this challenge by establishing a series of climate funds. The acknowledgement of deep gender inequalities as both driver and consequence of climate change was documented and discussed since the beginning of the 90s and officially recognized in the year 2010. In 2017, the UNFCCC came up with an action plan with targets for gender-responsive finance. And by now, all major financing mechanisms, such as the Global Environmental Facility and the Green Climate Fund, have gender equality-related mandates. Next slide, please. Many authors report significant gender integration improvements within existing multilateral climate funds, as we can see in the red line, the increase of funds towards climate-related projects with a gender equality focus. But a study of Oxfam, for example, for the years 2017 and 2018, revealed that only 1.5% of climate-related official development assistance really identify gender equality as a primary objective. So there are other important challenges, of course, that has to do with that not very often the climate finance is transparent enough to be tracked to its end use, and that for example, less than 10% of the finance was approved for locally led climate change projects during 2003 and 2016. And we know that women act mainly locally. So the last slide, please. Let's move on to the last slide. There are other concerns, more structural, let's say, from feminist groups and women movements that have to do with the use of this funding that don't take into account, for example, time poverty, or don't really tackle the issue of empowerment of women seriously or properly. As Mosdell explains, genuine empowerment always involves changing unequal power relations. So therefore goes beyond technical fixes, no? Or the last important critique from feminist movements is the instrumentalization of women and nature without attention to the critical linkages between the global environmental crisis and the profoundly unequal global economy, no? So summarizing this, as Lang mentions, without a short-term break on the overflowing growth patterns and a reorientation towards a human rather than an economic-centered development, gender equality cannot be achieved and the continuity of human life cannot be guaranteed. So this is a very fast overview of the issues on finance, climate towards gender equality. And please, next slide. Some of these issues will be discussed really with examples and in depth by our high-level panelists, who are Funmi Adeniji, Rocio Maldonado, Sasha Gavison, and Mary-Jane Kurzil. If we stop sharing now, yes, we can see live our panelists. And let me introduce first Funmi Adeniji. She is trained as a lawyer and holds a PhD in human rights protection. She's skilled in creating and coordinating projects with a human rights-based framework geared towards policy change, implementation, and prioritization of vulnerable groups, including women. And Funmi is passionate about social inclusion and gender justice. Currently, she works at ICLEI Africa as a people-centered rights-based expert on various projects. So welcome, Funmi. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Jenny.
Let's move now to Rocio Maldonado. She works as project advisor for the Zero Waste Project in Swiss Contact Foundation in close collaboration with the municipal government of La Paz in Bolivia. She has experience on waste management, climate change issues, and work on GHG emissions reductions for projects like solid waste and solar energy in Africa and Latin America. Thank you for being here, Rocio. Now, let me introduce Sasha. Sasha Gavison is the Executive Director of Women Engage for a Common Future, a network of ecofeminist organizations with partners in 70 countries working on women's rights, gender equality, climate justice, and sustainable development. Thank you, Sasha, for being here. And last but not least is Mary-Jane Kurtzil. She's a policy advisor of the GIZ Climate Policy Support Program, which directly advises the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. Her work focuses on climate change mitigation, including low carbon development strategies, just transition, climate finance, and gender climate nexus. And currently she's the gender focal point in her team. Welcome also, Mary-Jane. With that, please let's start with the first poll of our session, which I don't know, maybe it would be, yeah, you can read in the chat, again, the instructions given previously by Suzanne. The first poll goes, which of the following climate events has had the most impact on the African continent? You have here 5 options. Please kindly engage in this poll. I don't know how long we have. Julia, maybe 30 seconds.
Yes, I think 30 seconds are enough.
Yeah, great. So.
I am afraid the poll is not visible. Ah, okay, they posted a second one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have 30 seconds are over, so let's see the result. Most people, 56% say all of the above and 44% drought. Okay, the correct answer is all of the above, since Africa has been hardest hit by extreme weather events due to sharp rise in temperatures and the ensuing climate crisis. Thank you for engaging in this poll. So now let's move on and welcome again, Funmi. Please, Funmi, we are listening.
Thank you very much, Denise, and thank you to everyone who has engaged in the poll. I think that that's a great landing for us to start this very brief discussion on mainstreaming human and gender rights into climate resilience building. I'm going to be speaking today specifically to one of the projects in which we've been able to successfully do it, and in the city of Cape Coast in Ghana. Suzanne had initially mentioned in her introductions that Cape Coast is a sister city to the city of Bonn. And we thought that in terms of comparative analysis and seeing what's working in other jurisdictions, it will be great to spotlight this project. And the project actually is the Urban Natural Assets Project, which has been ongoing since 2014. But specifically, this phase of UNA has seek to mainstream a human and a gender rights-based approach through the 3 key pillars of the project: governance, planning, and finance. And the reasons are quite simple. The fact that the social context and the intersections of people's vulnerabilities means that people are disproportionately affected by the current climate crisis. Specifically, women in Africa are statistically one of the most affected groups of women when it comes to the climate crisis, and even just the tools they have to be able to address the multiplicity of crises which they are faced with, from food insecurity to lack of land tenure to limited access to healthcare. And this particular project, UNA, is looking for ways in which to build people's resilience in general, but with a specific spotlight on building women's resilience in response to the climate crisis. Just also to note that women also have one of the least economic opportunities when you're looking, and I'm happy about the slide which Dennis shared earlier, in which she was showing what percentage has gone into gender climate finance. And when you scale that down, particularly to the continent, African continent, and see how much exactly has actually gone to women, it's such a minuscule amount that it doesn't even matter at this point. So how has UNA been able to adopt gender inclusive approaches? First is the fact that we are very keen on education and awareness in human rights and gender rights, and the central role that women play in addressing the climate crisis. So when you work in specific context, and I'm speaking specifically within the Global South context, you understand that the inclusion of certain participants, particularly vulnerable people, is very key to be able to address the climate crisis that we are faced with. And being able to introduce gender discourses is also key to be able to address this, but also the how in our introducing of those discourses, because we're also working within very deeply patriarchal societies where this kind of discourses are not naturally encouraged or welcome. And our approach within the UNA project has been to vernacularize human rights and gender rights, helping participants within our learning labs to see how gender rights are not necessarily foreign, helping them to locate gender rights within folklore, within African folklore and African history. Also is the fact that we use very dynamic and participatory processes, which helps to break down power dynamics within those learning labs between duty bearers on the one hand and right holders regarding nature's contribution to people, and how that is addressed is broken down within our learning labs. Also, we've used data as a key entry point for evidence-based intervention. Over the last 1 year, we've carried out really extensive mapping processes in Cape Coast, but beyond the mapping processes, we've also done socioeconomic surveys, and our socioeconomic surveys have covered over 1,200 households in the city of Cape Coast. And it's helped give us an understanding of the nexus of human rights and its interaction with nature and with climate change. That the data that is emerging from that process is also helping to inform the ways in which we push for policy reform on climate change and on nature, helping to put forward evidence-based data which disaggregates across gender what are the hotspots and critical areas of vulnerabilities for intervention.
Finally, sorry, you have 1 minute.
Finally, we're also centering human and gender rights across our 3 main pillars of governance, of planning, and of finance. And UNA has been a great example of how donor funding can redirect the response to climate emergency by centering women at the middle of the project and ensuring that everything we do within the project, whether it's in the governance pillar, in the planning pillar, or in the finance pillar, is done through a gender rights lens. Thank you.
Thank you, Funmi. This is great to have such a great example of women being at the center of financing projects. So let's move on now to the next poll, which is about the core principles of the circular economy. And the questions to the public is, what is the core principle of the circular economy? Eliminating waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, regenerating nature, or all of the above. So we go again, we use the same method, going to the link, and we give 30 seconds for the public to engage in the poll. So do we have already some answers? Let's give some. Excellent, excellent. Most people have answered 63% keeping products and materials in use, and 38% answer all of the above, which is the correct answer. These are the 3 principles of the of the circular economy. That was a tricky question as we only asked for 1, but actually the 3 of them are the core principles of the circular economy. And we have now the correct answer. Thanks a lot. Okay, then let's now welcome Rocio from who is going to talk on behalf of the municipal government of La Paz. Please, Rocio, we are listening.
Okay. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can, and we can listen to you very well.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much. Yes, I am doing this presentation on behalf of the municipal government of La Paz, and I will present a project which has been carried out by Swiss Contact with the funding of Sweden. That this project has been carried out in the frame of the environmental policy of La Paz, which has these 5 axes, and this project has been done in the axe of waste management. So I will present briefly. It's a very concrete project which works with waste pickers, female waste pickers in La Paz. This is a group of very vulnerable people which has a very low level of education and very low access to opportunities for make their income, make their living. So they do this activity because in most of the cases they just don't have another option. And the project aims to dignify them. So because as the work they do is just looking in the waste to pick some valuable materials, people in most of the cases, they don't consider them as a good people. So, but the project looks to dignify them and improve a little bit their working conditions, make them work visible, make themselves visible and their work, and highlight the impact of what they do, because this project looks to reduce the amount of waste that goes to landfill. So the impact of what they do is very, very important. So for that, this here we show some of the actions that are being carried out in the frame of the project with the, as I said, with the close collaboration with the municipal government of La Paz. At the beginning, the work they do is, and at the moment it's still being informal, but we are working on formalizing this job, the work they do. So the municipal government of La Paz borrowed a space in a municipal space so they can have a collection center. This collection center allows them to store the materials they pick, so they can reach a more interesting amount of waste or recyclable material, so they can have a better prices and better conditions for themselves, and they can store a little bit more amount of work material. So this has been a very, very innovative initiative, because in the past the waste pickers were like an enemy for the municipal government, because in La Paz, municipal government has their own system for collection of recyclable materials, and in some way in the past the waste pickers were perceived as a concurrency for the municipality. But now with the municipal government of La Paz, municipal government of La Paz has a true intention to include the waste pickers in the policy of waste treatment, waste management. So this is a very, very good example of the intention of the municipal government to include this group and give them a little bit better conditions to improve this activity. Then the project and the municipal government of La Paz worked also on promoting the approach to approach the recyclers to people. So actually people, neighbors, institutions, companies, restaurants, any institution can actually directly contact them, so they can give them the waste recyclable material like plastics, papers, or aluminum, or any other material, recyclable material. So they don't have to look into the garbage anymore. So that's what the project looks to is promoting. And then the last but not least, maybe is one of the most important achievements or activities of this project, is the registration of the waste pickers as authorized operators for the municipality. So the municipal government of La Paz gave them identificator or a credential, so they recognize them as a true, important, and official operators or actors in waste management. So this is a very, very important issue, because with this recognition, they can actually contact, or maybe they can do alliances with other actors, or supermarkets, institutions, restaurants, schools, or any institution, so they can actually have a relationship, an equal relationship, so they can have many more opportunities of getting more material and better incomes for themselves.
Excellent. I
So,
think you have, sorry, you have 30 seconds, Rocio.
Okay. So here I will present very quickly the main results, that the number of pickers, and so we created associations for formalizing them, and here a little bit of the projections that we look for. And here we have a very, very important picture, which is where a waste picker in a public event having the opportunity of talk to everybody. So that's it.
Thanks a lot, Rocio. This was another great example of climate actions at local level that put women at the center. This was great. Thanks a lot. We will come back to you with a question later, which maybe you can expand the description of this experience. Now let's move on to the third poll before Sasha's presentation. And the third poll is about which share of philanthropic funding is aimed directly at the nexus of gender and climate. We have three options: less than 10%, less than 1%, less than 0.5%. So please, we ask to the public to engage in this poll, and we have again 30 seconds. Great. We have already some answers. Okay, great. We can now close the poll. And the correct answer, unfortunately, is less than 0.5%. 45% of the respondents were correct in their answer. Thank you very much again. Now we will welcome Sasha again. We are listening, Sasha.
Yes, thank you very much, Denise. And so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if that works and if you can see it in full screen mode. Yes, all fine?
Yes, it's okay. Excellent. We can see it.
So I'm the International Director for Women Engaged for Common Future. We're a civil society organization, and we were created specifically to engage women leaders and feminist organizations in climate and environmental processes and policies. And I will look at gender equal climate action. And I was asked to explain what is needed and also look at finance and a little bit at the gender action plan. So let's move to the next slide. Let's start just by saying that climate justice has to be at the heart of all climate action, because it's really terrible how communities which have least contributed to the climate crisis are carrying the main burden of the climate disasters. And that we, especially here in the global north, we're based in the Netherlands and Germany and France, that we have real responsibility to address these historic responsibilities, and specifically also look at the gender dimension, because climate change is not gender neutral. We know that in crisis situations, gender inequalities are often more strongly highlighted, that we have more gender-based violence, more restrictions on freedoms, and that we really have to take into account that there are multiple forms of structural inequalities which are linked to, therefore, to an intersectionality approach. We have to understand that you have, different discriminations coming together of gender, but also of race, of sexuality, of ability, ethnicity, etc. So we really need to take that into account when we look at what is needed, what type of gender equal climate action is needed. And in our network, we have every year an award for gender just climate solutions, and I'll just highlight one. We have every year a local grassroots program which we support with an award, and which we bring to the attentions of the policymakers, and then they get mentoring for another 5 years. And I would like to highlight one which is the award winner of 3 years ago from India, where Trupti Rai is working with women farmers who live in a region where you have 1 month of rain when the monsoon comes, and then the rest of the year it's dry and getting extremely dry with climate change. And so there's a quite simple technology, which is to capture rainwater during the monsoon in the underlying clay layers of the land with a small investment of maybe 6,000 euros for up to 10 farming communities. They can then continue to use water also in the dry periods and double or triple their harvests. And this is really often a situation between survival or non-survival, having to sell your land or being able to stay on your land. And the women do most of the land, the work on the land. And they're also the ones who are checking then if the system is working well. It's a simple system, but you have to check if it's not clogged. And since they're always on the land, they can do that very well. Now, the interesting example I want to mention is that the Indian government set aside a lot of funding for this technology. They said, hey, this is simple, this is not expensive, let's give grants for this. And these grants were not used. And the reason why is structural gender inequalities, because those who need it are women who, first of all, don't have access to finance or very little access to finance. 6,000 euros is too much. And they don't have land rights. So they need to first organize into cooperatives who get the tenure rights for the underground land to capture and store the water. These seem very simple things, but if you don't take that gender dimension into account, your nice climate technology won't work. So that was one of the reasons why we supported this project, because it really shows how you have to overcome structural barriers, underlying gender barriers. Now, the Paris Agreement recognizes how important it is. In its preamble, paragraph 11, it says, okay, we have to understand that this is about respecting, promoting human rights, addressing specifically the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, persons in vulnerable situations, and that gender equality and the empowerment of women is essential. But we also see that there is a lot of struggle to achieve this. This was in 2015. This year, 7 years later, we still had to really bring this to the attention of the policymakers, because we haven't seen enough progress. So at the Commission on Sustainable Development this year, it was reinforced that we have to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reductions, and throughout all policies and all programs, including the finance programs. It's not really happening yet. So at the national level, we have all the countries developing the NDCs and their climate adaptation plans, but often they do not really yet take into account the underlying structural barriers, which also need to be addressed. So we need a gender transformative approach, also for climate finance. Currently, climate finance goes into mitigation, which is to reduce the greenhouse gases, and that's where the majority of finance goes, and adaptation and climate resilience, which has been getting much less funding. And when we look at some of the statistics, we see that those projects which really target gender equality as a principal objective in climate projects are the ones which are more adaptation projects, and even there, only 7% of these projects were having gender as a principal objective, but that in, for example, the mitigation projects around energy generation, there was, and these are some older figures, but it's getting a little bit better, but it's still very unequal in energy generation and supply. So many of the mitigation projects, we still have a very, very low percentage of projects which really look at gender equality as a principal objective or a significant objective.
Yeah, sorry.
So there's a lot to do.
Yeah,
and that's where we have a gender action plan, and I'll end here. And the gender action plan of the UNFCCC has several priority areas and really also tries to address this issue of how to bring resources to the table for gender transformative climate action. Thank you very much. Back to you, Liz.
Great, Sasha. Thanks a lot. Now we have had an example from Africa, another from Latin America, and one from Asia now. That's great. We can see how different points in the world are witnessing these actions. So let's go now to our fourth and last poll of the session before we welcome Mary Jane. So our fourth poll, it's about what percentage of German climate funding till 2025 should be gender sensitive according to the OECD gender markers 1 and 2. So please, again, is the same procedure. For the public, you have here 3 options, 55%, 85%, and 93%. So we will have 30 seconds before seeing the results. Okay, great. We see that 42% of our respondents said 85%, 33 responded with 55 and only 25 with 93. Well, the 25% were correct because the correct answer is 93%. Thanks again. And now let's go and welcome Mary-Jane Kurtzil. Please, the floor is yours, Mary-Jane.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Also from my side, thank you for the introduction and also for setting the scene. Exactly, I'll dive right into it and use the next 5 minutes to very briefly introduce the role of the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, so the BMZ, in German international climate finance. And also how BMZ supports specifically gender equitable climate action at the more local or cities level. So let's start with some figures here. What is not generally known is that BMZ is actually the key actor in German international climate finance. So a little bit more than 85% of total German international climate finance is actually channeled through BMZ. And this amounted to roughly 4.4 billion euros in 2020. Now, there are two main channels of support. There's kind of a little less than a quarter of the money is spent through multilateral cooperation. That means contributions that the BMZ gives to multilateral funds such as the GCF or GEF, but also contributions to multilateral development banks such as the World Bank or Asian Development Bank and others. The larger share is being implemented through bilateral cooperation. This includes financial cooperation, but also what we call technical cooperation. And here we can again distinguish between two more channels. The roughly 68% of the money is spent through BMZ's main implementing partners. This includes GIZ, KfW, and also two others that are less known. And then there's a smaller amount of money, but nonetheless significant, I would say, that is spent in direct support of civil society organizations. So in general, we can say that there's kind of three modes of support in the international climate finance landscape: the bilateral cooperation, and then the multilateral cooperation, and then bilateral cooperation through implementing partners and direct support of civil society organizations. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now kind of how does the BMZ now address the question of gender equity in climate finance? Here, as many of you may know, our minister Svenja Schulz announced a feminist development policy earlier this year, and the proclaimed policy goal of that feminist development policy is to increase the total share of ODA that specifically targets gender equity to 93% in 2025. Now, this is total ODA, but there's of course huge potential to also increase this share in international climate finance. And this can be done on the one hand through increasing the share of gender responsive projects in what is bilateral cooperation of BMZ, and then also through leveraging the cloud of BMZ, where it sits in the boards of the multilateral funds and MDBs in the multilateral cooperation channel, so to say. So just to give an example for this last one, in the case of the Global Environment Facility, for example, BMZ very strongly supported the adoption of more inclusive frameworks for project design and also project implementation that specifically promote the participation of women, youth, and indigenous groups. And in this context, GF also committed to conduct a gap analysis that could then be used to better empower marginalized groups. Next slide, please. So exactly. Here, just on the a few words on this third dimension at this kind of climate, gender, and cities nexus that we are looking at. And the question kind of how does BMZ also support sustainable urban development? So sustainable urban development is actually one of 3 core areas in BMZ's overarching strategy on climate and energy. So yeah, I think the really central role that cities play in the climate and energy context is being recognized also by BMZ. And this is reflected on the one hand in the bilateral cooperation. So BMZ works with over 50 partner countries to really support sustainable urban development. And then this is also reflected in the multilateral engagement. So just two examples here. One is the City Climate Finance Gap Fund that was launched by BMZ and BMU together with Luxembourg in 2020. And yeah, this one supports, kind of provides early stage support and technical assistance to project preparation and planning. And then there's also the Urban Shift initiative, including the Sustainable Cities Impact Program, which was launched by GEF and UNEP and other partners in 2021. And yeah, this one kind of engages a broader set of public and different public and private actors that support subnational governments.
Mm-hmm.
And I also included
just sorry, you have 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, I won't go into the details of this project example, so I just included on the right-hand side an example for bilateral cooperation project at this Climate Gender Cities Nexus, which is on strengthening equitable access to sustainable urban mobility options, which was funded through BMZ and is currently being implemented through GIZ and C40s in 4 different Colombian cities, and yeah, has a series of activities that are planned to really kind of broaden the opportunities for gender just participation in urban mobility. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mary-Jane. This was great. Thank you for giving us this broad overview of the role of BMZ as key actor in climate finance and its approach, of course, to gender smart climate finance. So thanks to all our panelists. Now we will move on to the round of questions from the moderation. And I will ask you please to keep the answers short if possible. I will start with Funmi. Funmi, you have worked on identifying the drivers that can aid in building an enabling environment, improve access to resources, and facilitate individuals' ability to fully participate in gender-sensitive resilience initiatives. So the question for you would be, where do you think funding is needed to make the biggest impact, which could bring a cascade of positive transformations in both, climate action and gender relations?
Thank you, Denise. And there are a multiplicity of responses to that question, but I think that I will narrow it down to 3 main aspects, specifically when working in Global South context. And that is number 1, climate finance being directed towards research and data to be able to understand the particular barriers for women in terms of accessing finance, in terms of what are the systemic injustices and within those contexts. Secondly, is also in terms of access, and Sasha had spoken briefly in her presentations about what could routinely constitute barriers to women, and the fact that climate finance and most of the programs around climate needs to be directed at lowering those barriers for women if women are truly going to be able to access the finance that we need. Thirdly is the fact that we cannot continue to direct climate financing in a gender-blind kind of manner, that the way and the manner in which climate finances is directed in the global south must be very deliberately inclusive and must be targeted at women. It must prioritize women and it must put women at the center of financing. And I think a very good example is in many of the mitigation and adaptive funds that have been directed towards the agricultural sector. You know, and as many of the presentations have shown, women constitute most of the farm workers. But we have this systemic problem where women do not have land rights, are not owners. And so when that financing is directed at the landowners, the financing is not directed at the women. It's rather directed once again to continue to entrench systemic inequities. And so while we understand through data what are the problems, we must seek to lower the barriers and to grant better access to women. And then we must be very deliberate in the implementation of climate financing to reach women. Thank you.
Wow, this has been great, Funmi. You have summarized really a lot of what has been said here, and it's a great answer to take into account in our future endeavors. So the next question goes to Rocio. Rocio, please. What experiences does the government of La Paz City have looking for funding for gender and climate sensitive projects, such as the one with the female plastic pickers you just presented? So what were the obstacles and what were the open paths that you found in this way?
Thank you, Denise. Yeah, I think this was a very innovative experience for the municipality of La Paz. And actually, we don't have, also municipal government of La Paz doesn't actually look at particularly, the funding wasn't particularly looked for so gender issues and climate, no? So this was kind of secondary impact of this project. But even if the
okay, we are having some issues there with the connection. Okay, now it's completely frozen, so we could come back to Rocio later on. Now let's then, until she recovers the good connection, let's move to Sasha. Sasha, next question for you would be, Women Engaged for a Common Future stands for community engagement and global advocacy, no? For example, in the context of the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan. So can you share your experience and lessons learned from your projects? And what would be your advice to local governments wanting to prioritize gender equitable climate action?
Yeah, thank you, Denise. So we have some really great examples. For example, in Nigeria, where feminist women's organizations engaged with the local governments to develop local gender climate action plans and to integrate this into a national climate gender action plan and link it really also to the global level. So where we have a gender action plan of the UNFCCC, addressing indeed the 5 key areas of that plan, which is about understanding what's happening. We need the data, as we just also heard from Funmi. What are these underlying barriers? But also we need the resources, we need the capacities, and we need to be able to measure this. And so I think that is one area where we see some really great work being done, but it's really important to work with your feminist and you know, experts in this area who are all there in these countries. There's great networks of, and there's a lot of knowledge which is there, so we can make good use of that. Then what we also see is that, as Fumi also said, what are these underlying barriers, and how do we address them? It's a lot also about, as we heard earlier from you already, about the unpaid care burden on women. Even in Europe, women do 22 hours of unpaid care work compared to 9 hours by men. That's the average. And it's, you know, in some other regions of the world, it's even more. So there is this burden which we have to address. We have to have a strategy, a care economy strategy. We have to reduce that burden. We have to share that burden. And we have to find ways really to then create spaces for co-decision making for women. I mean, in many of the climate projects we do, the men will first say, but the women don't want to join our meetings. And when we go to the women say, yeah, but we can't join the meetings because they're being held when the kids are coming back from school and we have to feed them. So it's small things, but very important things to really create these decision-making spaces as spaces which are inclusive. So there's a lot of great experience out there, many great methodologies, but I think the first one is really to address the unequal power balances in all our decision-making bodies and make sure that we create specific spaces to bring in the local women, the indigenous women, persons with different sexual identity as well, because they're also often excluded. Women with disabilities, they're also often excluded. The rural farmer women, have them at the table, but make sure that we don't worsen their unpaid care burden while doing so. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha, for this comprehensive answer. And thank you for bringing up also the issue of care, which is so much important for women and for gender discussions at this time. So it seems that the connection with Rocio has been reestablished. So Rocio, if you could complete your answer, because we lost you, I think at the middle of your answer, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a connection issue. So I was saying that this project haven't been constructed by as a gender climate project, but the impact of the work they do is much bigger than what we thought at the very beginning. And during the implementation of the project, we identified some particular companies that are very, very interested by this kind of issues and public. So we are very encouraged to keep that these kind of initiatives can keep getting support of many. Maybe in the context of La Paz, looks like the private sector is interested by supporting these kind of initiatives in an easier way than maybe international fundings or this kind of opportunities.
Great, Rocio. This is a source of opportunity then found by the government of La Paz. Thanks a lot for completing your answer. We go now to our fourth panelist, to Mary Jane. Mary Jane, I think this is a very central question in the discussion. Is it possible to say that in general, the funding mechanisms have a move from allocating funds to women only to looking for a transformative impact in gender relations? Why and why not? If that's the answer, no?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a pretty complex question, and I will try to keep it short in the interest of time also. So I would say that in general, really the awareness for the importance of these really transformative approaches is increasing currently, has increased a little bit, is increasing. And there is also a growing movement, I would say, that really demands the consideration of these different gender aspects, talking of the intersectionality in different policy fields or across all policy fields. This is also being reflected in the current German government with the feminist development policy, the feminist foreign policy, and others. And I think this is then also linked to this call for action that has also been mentioned several times during the presentation now when it comes to finance. No, and this is in my opinion not only about really the accessibility of climate finance to women and other marginalized groups, but also about the representation of women in decision-making bodies. No? So I think, yeah, for example, in the climate funds, I think there's a discussion currently ongoing also in the MDBs and other finance institutions. And I would say that the relevance really of this topic and of transformative approaches is, to a certain extent at least, being recognized and also kind of reflected in strategic reorientations and adjustments of funding mechanisms and also in politics. And Germany is certainly trying to also push this topic on the agenda. BMZ is having it's kind of has these the policy goal now and tries to also increase the project portfolio that really follows those transformative approaches. At the same time, I think it is also important to acknowledge that it is a process that takes a lot of time and that also takes a lot of creativity, really, to then come up with new and innovative mechanisms that kind of manage to really address the challenges in a way that then do not create new issues or new problems, but really kind of manage to get the transformation going, so to say. Yeah, I would keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane. As you say, it's a complex issue, and thank you for giving us this picture of what's going on there in terms of transformative action. So the time is up, but I would ask our organizers to give us maybe 1 minute in case, Susan, there is 1 or 2 questions from the public. Back to you, Susan, if there is maybe a question that you consider could be answered still.
Yes, there definitely is one. It is asking for the feasibility of gender just financing and the influence gender-based violence has on it. I have written it in the chat as well in the wording.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How does gender-based violence reduce the feasibility of financing women initiatives for climate change mitigation and adaptation? And my first guess would be that Sasha and Funmi are already nodding and have something in mind.
Yes, please, Sasha, if you go first.
No, Funmi, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Sasha. I think it's just also understanding the insidious nature of gender-based violence and the fact that before we can even talk about women's empowerment and financing women have to feel safe, and gender-based violence in and of itself takes away that feeling of safety. That's the first thing. Secondly, the fact that gender-based violence is costly to economies, to countries. Certain countries have quantified how much gender-based violence, and it's an upwards of $5 billion per year that gender-based violence costs some economies, and that goes from medical costs to productivity, lost earnings. And when I think of what can be done to immediately address gender-based violence so that it doesn't be a stumbling block towards the financing of women and the empowerment of women, the first thing would be prevention. And that includes starting early, the education on learning stereotypes and gender norms that push gender-based violence. Also, the integration of laws and policies and the actual enforcement of that to dissuade people and to stop gender-based violence, but also effective accountability measures and women's access to justice. But also within the context of access to justice is also making sure that the mechanisms for access to justice are gender friendly for many women, because women also experience systemic violence and systemic barriers within the whole continuum of the justice system. Having said that, I come back again to this question of data to help understand. So we need data that helps to disaggregate and understand gender analysis and quantify risk and patterns. Where and within what sectors are we experiencing the most gender-based violence, to be able to target interventions. And the secondly, also channeling finance to address gender-based violence. So how do we channel finance in that regard is also channeling of capital to enterprises, to opportunities and to interventions. Even as basic as interventions like channeling finance to help women get divorced through the legal system is also a way of addressing that. Also advocating for the financial system to treat gender-based violence as valid, and so investing in that whole knowledge system on gender-based violence, and then targeted investments at women. Women's access to housing can actually be very directly related to how they respond to gender-based violence. Women's access to resources, women's access to jobs can help them to respond to gender-based violence. Sasha?
Yeah, I mean, amazing for me. You said it most all, I think, but of course we have, this could be the topic of a next session, I think, because there's a lot to discuss. On the one hand, the link to climate disasters and increased gender-based violence. Yeah, so if we have, you know, reduced resources, or we have had really also conflicts, armed conflicts because of disaster, there we have to have a strategy. And then we have to have indeed very good laws, which protect the survivors, which persecute the perpetrators, and we need all sectors to do that, because we see also in decision-making spaces where climate decisions are taken, there might also be gender-based violence, or there might be sexual harassment and abuse. So we do have an ILO 190C convention, which wants to create safe workspaces everywhere. Also in local authorities, and so I think we have a lot of instruments which are really key, which have proven that it reduces gender-based violence and sexual harassment and abuse. So let's make sure that all our colleagues know about them, that in our own institutions we're implementing them, and that we share and speak out. And we see that in some countries there might be statistics showing very high gender-based violence or sexual harassment and abuse, which are countries where the situation might be quite good, but where the awareness is higher, or where the laws are already better. And so, yeah, I think this should really also be one of the focus discussions we should continue on in the next session.
Thank you very much to all of you. Sincerely, this has been a great discussion. I think that's all the time we have for this session. Thanks, Funmi, Sasha, Rocio, Mary Jane. As Sasha said, we could discuss further in our next session. There is a lot still to be discussed. Today, we have seen some positive developments on climate funds with gender equity focus, current and future challenge, as well as the importance of the intersectionality aspect of vulnerability and structural discrimination. And if I can finalize this session by highlighting what Funmi has said, that's still to do and to work on such research and data, access to funding, climate, and that of course that climate funding should stop being gender blind, and the issues of systemic inequities such as property rights or violence, what important it is to integrate this in funding. So thank you very much. Thanks also to Susan and to the organizers of this session, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.